And would love to start out having the both of you talk about the work that you're doing to go after corporate concentration, but also can you talk about why? Why take on these fights? Because it's not something that every lawmaker is necessarily interested in. Ripley, can we start with you?
Is it already on? Okay, it is. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for having us today. And thank you all so much for the work that you've been doing truly to help us advance in our movement in Western Pennsylvania. I came to this, like so many other things, not as an expert, but someone who had a necessity, right, an experience. In Western Pennsylvania, I would say more specifically where I grew up, in Braddock, which is a town that some people have heard of, not for our hospital monopoly of UPMC, but instead for our original industry, which is U.S. Steel. And it's a region that has known its fair share of robber barons. In fact, it's what we're known for. In that town, when I was growing up, we had two industries in Braddock, right? We had U.S. Steel and we had UPMC, which was the hospital. And in a region where we have some of the worst air quality, where we have higher levels of pollution that then lead to higher levels of childhood asthma for the children, higher levels of COPD and other respiratory illnesses and cancers because of that pollution, a hospital was not just figuratively, but literally the lifeline of this community. But also, it was where we had almost as many jobs by the time I was coming up, which was long into the collapse of U.S. Steel. By the time I was coming up, it was actually UPMC Braddock Hospital that was the largest employer in our region. This was back when I was a young kid and the district and the region had looked completely different from the stories that I had learned about. By the time I decided to run in 2018, I ran for state house because of the cyclical nature of issues. I had this idea that I didn't think that people who were in power were thinking about how racism and inequality were cyclical. If you live in a Black and brown community, you were most likely to be redlined in that community. Those communities were most likely to be in closer proximity to that refinery or that mill, that pollutant, right? That source of environmental degradation. Those communities also, though, are medical deserts and food deserts. They're communities that are less likely to have transportation to get into job centers, to get to opportunity. And then all you can end up buying your next generation is a one-way ticket right back into that cycle. And that's what I was seeing. And when I was in law school, where I did not study antitrust, but I did look at that cycle. And what I thought was a unique quality of Braddock. When I left, I found out, actually, this is a common quality of all poor and working class communities all throughout the country. So when I first ran, we were running the Stop a Fracking proposal that was already sitting on top of our steel mill. Decades before, the biggest fight that we had since then was UPMC closing our hospital. People in our community protested, they organized, they put everything that they had to keep that in here, because we didn't just need that hospital because it kept people alive. Literally, there was nowhere else for folks to go. Remember, we have no transportation in and out of this community. And UPMC, which is a charity, a charitable hospital, a nonprofit with tax-exempt status, decided to move their hospital from a community that relied on Medicaid or some sort of subsidy, and they instead decided to build a luxury hospital in a more affluent community that the people of my district would not be able to access. I remember reading about medical deserts, areas where people would die because they had to travel miles and miles and miles for emergency situations, and I was seeing that happen right in my community. We fought and we lost. They closed that hospital. They have since opened many, many more. And not only have they done that, but UPMC is now the largest employee, and I'll remind you, and I'll tell you what that means. The University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And I want you to know, Pennsylvania is a big state. We just talked about it. If you come to Pennsylvania, you're coming to Philly, you're 5 hours from me. University of Pittsburgh Medical Center is not just the largest employer in Pittsburgh, it is the largest private employer in the Commonwealth of So they close hospitals and communities that they don't see worth in anymore. They don't pay their taxes, so we can't build up our neighborhoods. They move jobs away. And right now, they have control of over 3 out of 4 hospital jobs. But they also are a union buster. And when I started to run for office, I started to meet everywhere I went, in every community I went, I started to meet hospital workers, healthcare workers who had been putting their livelihoods on the line, literally being fired, being retaliated against, getting their job back, going through the cycle over and over and over. And those were the people who populated my campaigns. And that's who I learned from. That's how I learned how to fight. That's how I learned how to organize. But I got to start to meet them and to talk to them and to learn their struggle. Well, here they were at the forefront of the fight for 15 early on, because the largest employer was not paying our essential workers more than a minimum wage in some instances. Half of our workers have to avail themselves of a food pantry. Our largest employer, whose CEO was a billionaire at this point, or very close to it, was saying that his employees, if they cannot afford a turkey, could come to the turkey drive that they were sponsoring, or make them go to the employee-sponsored food pantry. I talked to a nurse who said, I don't go there because I don't want to take from my colleagues, because that's how bad and concentrated that problem is. Another half of the low-wage hospital workers have medical debt to their medical insurer, because they are not just a hospital monopoly, they also are the insurance carriers here. And one of our fights that we ended up having, because as we go through the years, our fights continue to pick up. So when I first started with them, it was with the Fight for 15. And then when I got into the State House, we found ourselves with a problem where they were gonna cancel the insurance of people who had the other insurance, the minor insurance in our community. That means we had the only children's hospital in the region, only hospitals for some unique cancers, some specialties, and they were going to kick those people to the curb. And we had to listen to story after story after story of cancer patient or child who was afraid that they would die. Some of them did. We ended up fighting back, getting a consent decree to expand that. But our fight continues on, because in the midst of the pandemic, what we were able to see is that UPMC uses not just union busting tactics, they use non-competes. They are the primary employer. So if at 3 out of 4 hospital jobs, if you're being abused by their employer, which they are, they can't even leave because of fear of retaliation or the fact that they have cornered the market. There is nowhere else for them to go. So I got into this fight because literally our economic justice is based on it, right? If we don't attack or address UPMC's non-charitable status, if we don't address the fact that they are a growing monopoly, still growing, then we are saying that our economic outlook in this area is basically dead, because there is nowhere else for anyone else to go. And we're saying that our labor drive is mostly dead because there is nowhere else for our workers to go. So I got involved in this not because, I just want to pick fights with giant corporations, right? US Steel or UPMC, but because the heart of our movement, our progressive movement, has to be workers. And our workers are the ones who are driving this. Our workers were the ones who came with legislation. They're the ones who came with an agenda. They're the ones who came with a model, an organizing model to hold this corporate giant accountable. And I'm proud that today, because of the work and the groundwork and the foundation that they've built, we now have folks like AELP who are coming in with reinforcements. We have folks who are coming and getting elevated to positions in every level of government who are committed now to holding this corporate giant accountable. But I also come with a word of caution that what UPMC is doing here is probably happening in your community too. And the reality is that what we do and what we are able to do here, the victories that we are working towards, are going to have some sort of bearing on what happens next in communities like yours. So I'm proud to be here. I'm going to hand it off. I'm sure you have more questions, but that's my story. That's how I got into politics, and it's what we're doing with our time here in politics.
Amen.
My story?
Yeah, what's your story?
Okay, what's my story? Hard to follow the Congress member. All right, so I'm from Astoria, Long Island City in Queens, for those of you that know New York, and when I try and give people a sense of our politics out there. It's instant recognition. I just say it's AOC's district in Congress. So you understand kind of our forces out there and what's happening. I grew up there. My parents were immigrants. And back then the neighborhood was, a wave of one immigrant community replacing another one, replacing another one. And my parents were from Greece, and all the Greeks came to Astoria in the 60s. But in the last decade or so, we are, if not the most, one of the most rapidly gentrifying communities in the country. And all the consequences of that are very evident to us, most notably in housing costs. And people are being turned out. The landlords are raising their rents, in some cases 50, 100% year to year, and people are being forced to move out. And those are the kind of the forces we've been dealing with when, to answer your question of how I got into this, a small little company called Amazon decided they wanted to, plant roots in our neighborhood. Fortunately, our politics, which I just referenced, were such that the community was up in arms about it. And interestingly, people from afar thought it was the best thing ever. People in New York, but not from experiencing the same hardships that my constituents were, thought it was the best thing ever, and couldn't understand why thousands of people were taken to the streets on a regular basis to oppose this thing. But just from the deal being announced, rents were going up. Wasn't even consummated yet, as you all know, it never was. But just from that announcement, the speculators were coming in, buying up apartments, raising rents, doing what they do. In the end, a confluence of forces, including our taking the state Senate majority that year, and my ascension to leadership and my maneuvering to get an appointment on an obscure board that ultimately would have had to approve the deal, led to them deciding not to come. I think it was the best thing ever. Other people don't. But I think, not too far from here in Virginia, you could see that the promises are already not being kept. We would have, there's all sorts of talk about the deal, and we could get into the details of it, but I know we have limited time. But the fact is there was real money going out the door to them, not just tax breaks. There was $500 million that was going to them just to build their buildings that fortunately we never had to spend. But that experience taught me a lot. And one thing I realized is market power is power, not just in the market, but over everything else. Market power becomes political power. It becomes power in a lot of facets of our lives. And from going through that, I met Pat here at AELP and some of the folks there, and we started thinking, well, why not have the states lead the way, or at least kind of give a nudge to our federal government to do things the way we think they should be done. We drafted a bill that would completely upend the way we do antitrust enforcement in the United States. We would move to a system that is akin to what a lot of other countries in the world are doing, focusing on an abuse of dominance standard as opposed to the current monopolization standard. And in reaction to that, a lot of folks who were against and concerned said, but wait a minute, if you do this, everyone's going to come to New York to try and enforce antitrust laws under this new standard. And I said, yes. That is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to help our like-minded colleagues in the nation's capital kind of move things in the right direction. And if it happens that New York is leading the way, then so be it. There is a blueprint for that, by the way. Many years ago, I wrote a law that New York passed called the Airline Passengers Bill of Rights. I don't know how many of you remember, used to sit on a tarmac for 2-3 hours. They wouldn't let you off. Like, all sorts of horror stories coming out of that. We passed a law that everyone said was unconstitutional because that's federal preemption on airline regulation. But we passed it. There was lawsuits going on, blah, blah, blah. It went on for years. And in the meantime, while our law was getting adjudicated, the Obama administration made it the law of the land through regulation. And so there's ways that states can help set an example and help move the debate, and that's what we're trying to do. It passes the Senate. It's passed the Senate the last 2 years. We're trying to get our colleagues in the Assembly now to move forward with us on this. I think there's going to be some real progress on that in the next week or so that hopefully you'll hear about. And if we do this, your entire conversation, your entire conference would be about the subject of the new enforcement regime and how we can really give people and competitors a chance. The other thing I'd say before we move on to the next round of questions is the business community likes to suggest that this is anti-business somehow. But nothing could be further from the truth. We had a hearing about this bill in New York, and there were medium and small-sized businesses that came to say this is something we need because they're the victims ultimately of of the market concentration, the abuses that the big players are imposing on them. I think we had Yelp, most notably, was there as an advocate for what we're trying to do. And then, of course, the big tech especially, but all the big corporations, they're very skilled at what they do, and they pay their lobbyists and consultants a lot of money to come up with these fake organizations that purport to speak for everybody and tell us how bad it is. And we had one of them at our hearing, and I started asking him questions. I said, great, who funds your organization? What? Oh, I don't know, it's not something we want to talk about. I'm like, but that's important. Who are you speaking for? We're speaking for the business community, right, but who's paying you? Oh, our filings will show this. Like, they just wouldn't answer the question. It was very embarrassing for them. But it really revealed kind of the lengths to which and the skill with which this community fights back. And they have the resources. They have the power, as we discussed, not just the market power, but look at our friends in Seattle try to poke their heads out of the ground and impose a tax on big companies to provide for homeless services. And Amazon obliterated them, or tried to anyway, in political campaigns with millions and millions of dollars of spending on city council races, mind you. Like, that's a lot of money in a city council race. It's a lot of money anywhere, but it's really impactful that way. But all this stuff is, look, we have a network in this country that is built by and for these people. Campaign finance is part of the problem. The way our antitrust laws are written is part of the problem. There's a lot of things we need to peel apart and fix, and I know the Congress members working on that here. We're working on it in New York, and look forward to making some progress.
Thank you. You both just now talked about the real people on the ground in your districts who are being impacted by this. This is an issue that can feel esoteric. It's about case law. What does the word antitrust have to do with my life? I wonder if you can talk about how you make this resonate with regular people, and can that help spur action at the federal level where perhaps it gets a little more esoteric, from the ground up? What are the efforts that you're doing in your districts with everyday people? How does that impact what's happening in Congress or in the agencies that are in charge of this?
Well, I think it is very difficult to get the public engaged on antitrust law. And what we have done is we have great grassroots organizations that are working with us in New York. Organized labor is a big part of it, which is why the monopsony and the worker aspect of this is so relevant. The Teamsters have jumped in on our bill and are helping move the ball in the AFL in New York is supportive of what we're doing. But you have to get credible representatives to talk to people who respond to them. If I just go before a group, and you guys are all interested in this, but if I were at a town hall, I'm like, antitrust law, they'd look at me cross-eyed, and I could spend 2 hours trying to explain to them why, and they probably get it, but it's better if you're a member of a labor organization and your president is telling you this is important for our well-being and our survival. And so I think coalition building is a very big part of it. We're working hard to do that in New York, and that's why the bill's had success in the Senate. Hopefully we'll get the other house to join us.
Yeah, I'll just add very quickly that antitrust obviously is not something that, lay people understand, with the type of legal mind that you do, right? Or that a legislator does. But I'll tell you, in Pittsburgh, understanding UPMC, you can't miss what's happening with UPMC. It looms that largely over our region. So the workers' families, so many people are in the industry in some way. And I'll remind you that our hospital workers aren't just nurses and doctors. Our hospital workers are janitors, our hospital workers are food service workers. So many different roles come through UPMC. And UPMC has become so oppressive and so anti-worker that everyone in the region understands what's happening. People just intuitively understand the implications of, we can't form this union, which means that we can't bargain for better health care with our healthcare provider and worker and our employer, right? They understand intuitively that because I am a nurse and 3 out of 4 healthcare jobs comes through this company, they understand that there is nowhere else for them to go. So helping them to understand the antitrust part of it really, I don't think is entirely necessary. We can talk collectively collectively, and we do, about what are some solutions to the problem that we are experiencing on the ground. And I don't think that it's important, and this is not dumbing it down at all. I think it's actually bringing it up. It's bringing us as legislators up to their intuitive understanding of their lived experiences and meeting that moment with solutions that they are helping to drive.
Can you talk about the countervailing forces that you're up against? I would imagine it's concentrated corporate power, but is it other things? You know, your colleagues, is it hard to get them on board? Fellow lawmakers, are they as excited about this as you are? And like, what does it take to get people activated on this so that you can fight against, you know, the lobbyists and the corporate interests that are coming at you?
I'll go first. The senator started it, and this is also my crusade. Money in politics is one of the largest factors and forces that keeps us from so many of the different things that we recognize would bring about economic justice, bring about safety, bring about some sort of fairness across the board. When we think about how much money these corporations are able to flood into races, to absolutely flood into races, they're able to buy politicians. There are so many politicians who they answer not to constituents, they answer directly to that board of directors for that corporation. They answer every cycle to them. And we can't overstate how big a problem that is. There are so many politicians and colleagues who don't disagree with us for whatever it is. And we're talking here about corporate consolidation. But we can say the same about gun control. We can say the same about education reform and environmental justice. But the reality is that there is a fear that in speaking out against these corporate giants, as they amass more and more power, that they are going to then turn their gaze to you, that little politician, that one representative. So I think that is one of the biggest roadblocks that we have. The second is that there are some people who actually genuinely want them to keep that power, right? And those are the bigger impediments. The ones who want them to keep that power because they have a vested interest, they have a stake in it. They're able to trade in stocks, and they feel that they are a part of the game. So I think that is another one of our big impediments. But for us also, with UPMC, for instance, is that we have to have cooperation between multiple levels of government. It's not just a federal issue. It's also a state and local and county one. It's also federal. And we have to recognize that if we don't have people who are willing to attack it all at the same time and be able to hit it from every single angle, that it makes it harder and it prolongs the fight.
I would agree with all that. I'd say at the state level, an additional challenge we have is just getting people's heads around it, because it's not something we normally deal with. Right? We're generalists. We just finished the state budget in New York dealing with probably 100 issues all at once. So we know a lot of things about a lot of things, but not very deep. and to get into antitrust law, you really have to get into it. And I think that's one of the, I got a couple of year jump on my assembly colleagues because of the experience we had with Amazon. But part of the delay on their side thing is just getting into the information, getting them to comprehend what it's at stake, getting them to understand what the changes we're suggesting would mean. And it's just never, you just talk to a state rep, you were one, Congress member. It's not like antitrust law is at the front of mind when you're sitting there at the State House. But we're trying to get it there because it has massive implications across the board. And I think it's something where all levels of government do have to work together.
Speaking of, are there opportunities to work across state lines? And is that important in this work, that states are standing together, that localities are standing together?
Certainly. And I mean, we see this on a lot of issues. And I think, we're biased, but like New York and California often set policies that are a little bit forward-thinking in my mind, and then other states start engaging and putting their own twists on it. And debates really do move. States really are the laboratories, for good or for bad. There's a lot of bad going on in the country right now in that respect too. But I think we have an opportunity to do something, and we've already had outreach from colleagues in other states about what we're doing, and people who want to do it in their own states. So yes, there's a lot of collaboration, and I think once there's a success somewhere, it really accelerates the progress. And so that's what, again, we're hoping we could set an example in New York.
Do you have any stories in particular? I mean, you were talking very generally and very eloquently about what you've been seeing on the ground, but of people who have brought stories to you about how this has really impacted their lived experience. What does it mean to be an average person whose life has been derailed by corporate power?
Certainly, I know many. I talked briefly about the food pantry. One of the organizers who has become one of my good friends who had medical debt to her employer. That story you can multiply. I know organizers who have lost their jobs multiple times, and finally have now had to find a new line of work because UPMC will not allow him to come back. We are now in the midst of a threat of another closure in another community, another Black community that is already divested. This is a community that isn't as close to, say, the city as Braddock, my hometown, is. This is a community that's even further out. And these folks rely on these services, and they won't have the advantage of being able to at least be able to catch 2 buses to get to the next luxury hospital. So we're already seeing on the ground people who are having to find new transportation, trying to find new ways of getting there. Also, I mean, their tax exempt status. The thing that we think about every single day in Pittsburgh, you know, when you talk about a pothole, when we talk about the underfunding of our schools, when we talk about the different services and social safety nets that we're not able to invest in our region, while we also have what's called a not-for-profit that makes $1 billion in profits every year, right? So that issue it genuinely impacts everyone. I could pull out individual stories, but I don't need to because they actually impact every single person.
Yeah, and for us, it was housing. I touched on it earlier, but there were real people who I can list for you who got kicked out of their homes just from the announcement of the deal. Because immediately, like that, the rents were being jacked up. And what was really upsetting to me and frustrating is the small businesses in the area get manipulated by this process. They had been, you know, they were convinced they hit a gold mine, right? Like the local deli or the pizzeria was like, all these workers, they're going to come eat here. And what I actually did, I went out to visited Seattle, and you know, I did real work when this deal was on the table, and I took a look at what Amazon meant for the community there and the small businesses there. Turns out it was disaster for the small businesses. Why? Because these campuses are campuses. So they have their own cafeterias, they have their own services on site, and all the independent local businesses struggled or failed. And so, yeah, a lot of the local business community ended up being upset by the way that turned out because they incorrectly believed what it meant for them. But the people who lived there, it was awful. Even for those few couple of months when it was believed to be happening, had real detrimental impact on people's lives.
All right, we are at time. Thank you both so much for sharing your experiences and your expertise with us. This was great.